Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I did say good morning, I believe. Thank you. I want to like that southern hospitality that I've heard so much about. So. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christopher Ludwig. I'm the editor of the Automotive Logistics group of magazines, which hopefully you're familiar with, or if you're not, you will have received it in your delegate bag so that you can quickly become familiar with it. It's my pleasure to join Louis and the speakers from the first morning to welcome you here in Atlanta. It's a pleasure for me to be here in this wonderful city, first time. I think session one got us off to a really great start, obviously in terms of laying the groundwork for some of the market, let's say the market trends and market dynamics that we're seeing, which of course is also impacting on production and supply chain geographies, whether it's the low oil price, which is clearly pushing up SUV and crossover sales, and indeed leading OEMs to reorientate the way they produce, particularly in the US over the next couple of years, with more small car production in Mexico and larger cars here. And of course the impacts that will have certainly on the supply chain. I also thought, and I think it's part of the reason we come to these kind of conferences should be not just to hear what we know or what's familiar, but to kind of be challenged and think about new ideas. So I thought Benoit's presentation on the hyper-connected network was really interesting and really, got me thinking about some things. I spent a lot of time interviewing car makers and manufacturers about their networks, and I think clearly most probably would brag more about, 80% full truckloads and how efficient the networks are run kind of within their plant groups and stuff, and how maybe they've reduced the consolidation as opposed to maybe increasing it. But there's different ways that we can think about that, whether it's the empty trucks on the way back or what sharing more would mean. And I think some of you in the audience probably are looking towards that vision as well. So again, if nothing else, it challenges us. It makes us consider and look at what others are doing, whether across the industry or across other sectors. Coming back a little bit now more to the session at hand and I guess the industry as we face it today. This session, it's called Linking North America. So we're talking about the sort of integration across the North American supply chain in the US, Canada, and of course, perhaps most especially Mexico. I just got back there myself last week. You all know the statistics and the forecast going from 3.5 to 5 million. Audi, Kia, Mercedes, BMW, Ford, you name it, they're all building new factories, or if they're not building new ones, they're expanding, or like Fiat, Chrysler, bringing Jeep production. So a lot of stuff happening in Mexico, especially, but of course here we are in the U.S. South. Tremendous growth in this region too, whether it's the German OEMs here or the Korean or indeed back in the manufacturing heartland in Detroit. And I think although Benoit mentioned this morning about the supply chain, although it's quite dense and complex, that maybe it's somewhat in isolation, and I think I understand what he means and agree in many ways, but nonetheless, none of these things are happening purely in isolation. So, Wendi, you're going to be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure when you move Jeep production to Mexico, there's a huge interaction between the existing supplier base in the Midwest, between migrating new suppliers and bringing them online and exchanging material going both ways, which raises the level of complexity tremendously. And of course, the big challenge there is certainly in logistics. So I think that's some of the themes that we'll talk about we'll hear from our panelists about, and we can talk further about during the Q&A. We've got two great panelists here who each have a presentation. I'd like to introduce them to you now. We're very pleased for the first time at one of our conferences to have Wendi Gentry-Stuenkel as the head of inbound logistics and auto transportation for Fiat Chrysler. And we're also joined by Juan Calvillo, Director of Supply Chain Excellence at Ryder de Mexico. So each of them will have some slides, speak about 20 minutes or so, and usual format, we'll save our questions for the end. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Wendi.
Good morning to all of you. Whether you notice or not in my bio, I'm actually new to the transportation end of our business. I've worked in supply chain and purchasing for about 25 years now, actually starting off my career in manufacturing. So I'm going to bring a little different perspective to understand a little better of why do some of our logistics networks end up like they do, and why are our suppliers where they are, and how we can use that to really build more robust networks and have a look going forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of the industry. You've already heard about that quite a bit from PricewaterhouseCoopers and their view of it. I've got some statistics in here too that are slightly different, but the message is consistent. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing to minimize the variability in our supply chain. But because we can't completely eliminate it, what do we do to better manage that variability? So I'm starting with a slide. About a year ago, our CEO, Sergio Marchionne, when he was doing his first quarter analyst call, had a presentation called Confessions of a Capital Junkie. And that presentation generated quite a bit of media response and a lot of discussions about consolidation in the industry. And I'm not here to talk about what might happen at an OEM level, but I am here to talk about what happens at a supplier level. And again, Brandon hit on that earlier in terms of the activities of the mergers and acquisitions going on in our supply base. And it's just basic economics. If you look at what is happening with automobiles, they are becoming incredibly complex. And it's driven from two different angles. One is a regulatory standpoint. The greenhouse gas pressures that we have are immense. And so when we look at our emissions regulations, what we need to do from a weight savings perspective, there's technology going into every part on the car. They're no longer just plain old stampings. It's high strength steels, it's new formulations that require an incredible amount of ER&D from the supply base, as well as intense capital investment. So all of those things are driving a smaller and smaller supply base, and we're all being drawn to the same people. We've also got it on the safety front. I mean, every morning I wake up and there's another article in the news about what's happening with NHTSA that day. And so as we have more pressure on the safety regulations, again, it's driving technology into our vehicles. And all of that's before you even get to the customer, and what does the customer really want? Because some of these things they're asking for, and some of them they may not be directly asking for or willing to pay for. And so it's all the connected car things that we were talking about. They want to be connected. They want infotainment systems that are continuously being updated. Just because they own their car for 5 years doesn't mean that they want to have a 5-year-old infotainment system. And so that's driving a lot of activity there and tremendous research and development. And so what that means is that we've got a push towards standardization, because you can't possibly do these things all for the launch of one vehicle. I can't do all of these things just for our new launch in Toluca. I've got to spread that across multiple vehicles, and suppliers with the technology need to spread it across multiple customers. So at the same time that we would love to have tighter supply chain networks, what really happens is that we've got this huge capital investment that's driving suppliers to just a few locations in the world. So we've got a trade-off, and supply chain isn't necessarily winning the war in that. We're really going to the same places, and the suppliers are locating in the place that makes most economic sense for them. And that's to serve as many customers as possible. So anytime that I walk into a tier 1 supplier, unless it's someone who's contiguous to one of our plants, they're supporting not only us, but many of my competitors. And so we're dealing with the same companies, it's the same locations, it's the same people. We're all fighting for the best resources at each one of them. And those poor material managers at the tier 1s are trying to satisfy all of their customers who aren't always well aligned in their standardized processes. And so that becomes a key opportunity for us. Earlier, when our esteemed colleague from Georgia Tech was speaking, he talked about this open consolidation. And that's really going to be the forefront for us making progress as an industry. And we can do some of those things through AIG, but ultimately becomes the individual relationships between us. And how open are we to really doing that to help the efficiency of our suppliers? Because it even comes down to we're using the same lines. It's coming off the same capital equipment. And if any of you doubt that, when we had a hurricane in Japan last month, Almost every OEM is working with that same supplier and dozens of tier ones trying to figure out how do we get this limited allocation of microchips into our products so that we don't interrupt production. So my numbers might vary a little bit from those that you saw earlier, but I think that the message is still the same. From an FCA standpoint, we really think that this year, next year, are pretty much the peak of the market. Now, one thing that should concern everybody from a forecast standpoint goes back to a quote from Yogi Berra, is that the problem with a forecast is that you have to predict the future. And my experience has been, with all due respect to some of you in the room, nobody's very good at it. So I got a new tool last night. I don't know if any of the rest of you got a fortune-telling fish from our colleagues at UPDS, but I might rely on that just as much as some of the numbers that are out there. Because we all try to estimate based on the analytics that we have and the macroeconomic things that are going on, but it's a little tough to predict, particularly with the number of scandals and things that go on in the world that can have a pretty significant impact to the economy. The point of the slide, though, is that in the US market, we've pretty much tapped out. I mean, this is it. The growth isn't going to continue at a significant rate. And so what does that mean to our supply base? It's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of continued expansion of that supply base, because what everybody is very cognizant of is what happened before when we were in a significant oversupply condition. This is very similar to some of the charts you saw before in the same corridor of, well, here's where we're all at. And so we're spread within NAFTA over about 3,000 miles or so, going from central Mexico all the way up to Ontario. And so that's a challenge for all of us, because the longer the supply chain, the more variability that we have. And it just introduces more potential failure modes. A good example, I ran across this brochure that we had, and it has to do with our Charger and Challenger Hellcat product. It's a product that we can't nearly satisfy demand. In my last position, I actually worked in supply chain, but I worked more on the demand planning and long-term planning with our dealer body. And so this is a product that's near and dear to my heart, because my phone rang off the hook every day with the dealers begging me for more, and interesting letters from customers that were huge fans. But if you just look at the route of this, we've got our Hellcat engines being produced in Saltillo Engine, flowing up to our assembly plant in Brampton, Ontario, outside of Toronto, and then the finished vehicles flowing back out really all over the world, but in this example, flowing to a dealership in Kentucky. And so for those that aren't in the logistics industry, it all sounds quite simple, except for all the borders that we continue to cross and all the other natural events that we run into and all the things that all of you are experts on. So getting into Mexico, we all know the statistics, but what's shocking is how much growth has happened there. And beyond the growth, the struggles that we have from a supply base and a OEM perspective with just the demand for people. When I look at my job a few years ago, I handled our risk management group. So I dealt with crises all day. We were the hotline 24/7 for anybody having any type of production difficulties. And I will tell you that one of the most common difficulties beyond the dramatic natural events is really a people issue. And the turnover and retention issues, especially in these high growth regions, where you find that people are coming in and out the door just as quickly as they're getting trained for economic benefit. And so that's one of the tough struggles, and it's not just the production operators, it's the management team, it's the maintenance people. It's not that the equipment that they're trying to run has a struggle, it's that they don't have anybody there that knows how to run it. And so what does that mean to us when we're sending trucks in and they've got these frequent interruptions in production? It doesn't make for the smoothest flow of operations. And so that's one of the sources of variability that we're really going after. And what does that do to your inventory strategy at your assembly plant when you know that those type of things are not, they have a high degree of variability. And so that's something that we have to continually look at in terms of what kind of variation are we dealing with. When we look at the statistics, we've got over 2,500 companies in Mexico that are engaged in manufacturing auto parts. Just about every supplier that we deal with is there. And in our case, we've got some local production to Mexico, but we have quite a bit that's flowing up to our plants in the Detroit area and throughout the Midwest and into Ontario. We've also got a lot of parts that are flowing south as well. As I tease my team, sometimes I have engines that are like ships passing in the night, and I'm saying, I just wish that I could produce every engine local to the assembly plant. Again, the enemy there is the capital investment to make things like engines and a lot of the other parts on the car. It's simply not practical to make that level of investment. So it's wonderful from an academic standpoint, but it's just something that's not terribly practical. And so that's one of the things that we have to figure out is how do we really get this hyper-connected transportation? And I think that only comes through us consolidating our efforts, really working in partnership, because most of us are going to the same place to pick up freight. So the other significant thing in Mexico is that they've got 45 different trade agreements, which makes it a place for tremendous opportunity, but it also becomes important to understand the nuances of each of those trade agreements. Within FCA, customs actually falls under my area of responsibility, which is sometimes a unique model. In other companies, it falls under other compliance organizations. For us, it's key to have it part of the operations team so that they never lose sight of the sense of urgency in getting the products and making sure that absolutely nothing is stuck at our borders. But to do that, you really have to understand each of the existing trade agreements so that you don't run into any compliance issues, because they can be tremendously expensive. So for us, we invest heavily in our relationships with Customs and Border Protection in these regions. And what I mean by that is not only enrolling in their programs, but often actually setting ourselves up to be the guinea pigs of new processes and really helping them design new processes, because the intent they're trying to fulfill, we all support. How do we do that in an operational way that doesn't become terribly burdensome? So how do we work with the government to both ensure the compliance, ensure the safety of things, make sure that things are transported legally and the appropriate duties are paid, but how do we do that very, very efficiently? And so we do that through things like we're a level 3 CTPAT, and I know AIG can take folks through more of that. We actually went through an audit just last week in Canada, because we actually have a private fleet that I'm responsible for. I've got about 300 tractors, 1,300 trailers, and so as part of that, our trucking terminal was audited to CTPAT. And the good news is we did fabulous on the audit. They identified a few best practices there. But it really opened my eyes as a new person in the job by hearing the stories from Customs and Border Protection and the Canadian Partners in Protection of what kind of smuggling activities can happen, and the person who's actually doing it is completely unaware. They're nothing but a mule. And some of these stories did nothing but keep me up at night in a state of paranoia of all the things that can really happen, and we're just innocently trying to get our goods across the borders. So we do that. We're part of an importer self-assessment, and in Canada, Partners in Compliance and the Mexico programs, as well as Europe, because all of those things really allow us to be benchmarked in goods transporting across those borders, because the more material that moves, the more important those programs are. And so with that, we're huge users and endorsers of the FAST program so that we can clear our material in advance. We've also gotten quite advanced because we do a lot of trade between the US and Canada and how we use that CSA program. And there's a list of other initiatives that we have here, but we've consistently been on the leading edge of them. And sometimes when our competitors have called us and said, boy, how are things going with the ACE launch? We've said, fine, haven't heard a word. What do you mean? Well, we've got good stuck. We can't break it free. We're having to expedite around it. And I think all of that is just a testament to our partnership with those agencies and how we've really been involved in the piloting of it to be able to work through the learning curves. Because if you've got a lot of goods that are going to move across NAFTA, you've got to be able to do it almost as if those borders don't exist. The other part on minimizing our variability is when we've got these longer supply chains, there's just really no tolerance for things going wrong. And so how do we use an FMEA type process to go through and make sure that we've tried to eliminate as much of the risk as we can, but then put in other mitigations to address it? And so in our carrier assessment, we actually took the MMOG model that you hear about through AIAG and came up with a questionnaire for our carriers. And when I came into this job and said, oh, we go out and audit the carriers, what do they think of that? And I fully expected to hear, well, you know, they don't really like it, but they comply. And I was really shocked when I sat with our Carrier Advisory Council of how supportive they were of our efforts there. Because most people don't like to get a report card, right? I don't love it when it's performance review time at my company, okay? And so I thought, wow, they really like it. Why? And so I sat down with the carriers, and I think it has less to do with the questionnaire as the approach in doing it. What they shared with me was that the people that we send in are not rookies. They know something. They know more than how to just read the questions on the paper. And it's really about their intentions. They are truly there to share best practices and figure out how the carriers can get better at what they're doing. And we give the carriers, we give them the test in advance and say, do your own self-assessment. And one of the things that's encouraging to me is that the carriers often find something in their self-assessment and address it before we even get there, which tells me that they believe in it. And many of them have really seen improved performance. What I've been able to see is significant improvements in our scorecard. In fact, our carrier base, there has become really little that distinguishes the top quadrant of our carrier base. They're all just doing an absolutely fantastic job. Now, their scores might vary slightly, but to me, that's measurement variability. They're really all that good. The tough part for that is if you're trying to break into business with us, I have some really good guys that I'm going to stay with, as long as they continue to perform. So we talked before about the assembly locations. The supplier locations really aren't that different. They largely mimic us for obvious reasons. Now, my view of the network is a little bit less sophisticated than the one that was shown to you earlier of this hyperconnectivity. But the premise is exactly the same. I am going into the very same suppliers that many of my competitors are. And some of those suppliers aren't near any of our plants. So can we consolidate our freight and get it to some consolidation points? And we're already doing some of that with some of my competitors. Where I think the next horizon is that we've done it, and I don't think we've necessarily actively managed the relationship. We set it up in the beginning, we kind of put it in place, but I'm not seeing the level of active management that's necessary in our really dynamic environment. And so if we really want to get to the next level, it requires a lot more open collaboration on a continual basis, weekly basis, not yearly, hey, how are things going? That's really where the efficiencies, I think, are going to come from. The other thing that we've found is because we do have long hauls, is we're using a lot of rail and intermodal, a lot more than our competitors. We found, and some of it is just based on where the economy is that due to decreases in other sectors, there's a lot of capacity out there, and performance has really been quite strong. And so where I can guarantee the service level that my customers need, why not do it? I mean, this is just a pricing index, but where you see where it's at, you can't deny the physics of rail and intermodal. It is very inexpensive. It's also great from a sustainability standpoint, which is really important to us. And so we look at it from a CO2 and say, where else can I actually do that? The part that you have to pay attention to, and this is like statistics 101, But sometimes I've watched our operating groups get into discussion about how the averages are trending. And that's nice to know, but if you don't know the standard deviation, it's completely irrelevant. Because what I've got to do is I've got to tighten up that range so that it's very repeatable. Again, it's about getting rid of the variability. So I might be able to tolerate a slightly higher average as long as it's very predictable. But to get to a lower average, but my range is huge, doesn't do me any good at all. So if you're moving into those modes, that becomes a really important point of discussion. And these are just some statistics from our sustainability report where you can see that our use of rail and intermodal has increased from 40 to 44% from 2013 to 2015. And for 2016, we expect that to get quite a bit higher. And the reason for that is because as the industry was rebounding so quickly, we were honestly having trouble keeping up with a lot of our suppliers. And so even though the ideal transit mode might have been rail or intermodal, I just couldn't get them there because I didn't have the supply of parts. And so we're finally to the point, because of the leveling out of the volumes, that we can actually do that. But as I mentioned before, it comes down to having robust networks and really strong partnerships. And so what's interesting is you really have to build a partnership with your competition, but you have to be willing to do it. And that comes down to individual relationships. Can you build that trust? Can you find the third parties to help you facilitate that, so that you're not getting into any issues from a trade and security standpoint? But do you have some partners that are really willing to do that? And I think that becomes our frontier in where we can really take things to the level that we were talking about in that earlier presentation. A lot of that is having the data and sharing the data. You hear a lot about business analytics. You even hear about it on TV now, on commercials, which I find really interesting, that they're using that media to attract consumers on business analytics, when I hear guys like IBM advertising this. But there is a lot of data. There's lots of visibility that we can have. How willing are we to be able to share that data across the industry? And then filtering through it for meaningful indicators. I think that's the part that a lot of folks are struggling for. I can tell you where every truck in my network is. Great. Now what are you going to do about it? That's the important part, because I'll tell you, in our systems, we have some older systems, but I'll tell you, they are very effective in telling me which late trucks I actually care about, because a lot of them I don't. But we've got good filters that tell us which ones really are going to impact our production. So the data takes you into that operational exception-based reporting. We're using a lot for demand planning. I mean, how do I get better at the analytics so that I can have far more visibility, so that in my logistics planning, I can really understand what's going on from a demand standpoint? The hard part is that comes back to forecasting, and I got to have something better than this fish, although I do like the fish. It's further integrated S&OP processes to really drive the business. I mean, what's really going on from a customer demand standpoint? Because that's where it all starts. That's the only part that matters. What kind of scenario planning are you doing? You better not plan on just one scenario, because again, we can't predict the future, so we've got to be proactive in identifying what are some of those what ifs and planning some flexibility around them to really be able to respond as quickly as possible. Those are the game changers that will differentiate us, particularly in this industry. So I'm going to leave you with one last little story, and again, this came from Mr. Marchione's presentation to our investors. And it's a story from Alice in Wonderland, where Alice is saying, in our country, to get somewhere else, you have to run really, really fast for a really long time. And the Queen said, well, that's a slow sort of country. Here, you can do all the running you can do, but you're just going to stay in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you have to run at least twice as fast as that. And that's really what we're confronted with in the automotive industry. I don't have to tell any of you how hyper-competitive it is. And just running is what everybody's doing. You're just staying in the same place. You actually have to run twice as fast to get somewhere different than where you're at today. With that, I'm going to pass off to my colleague.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much, Wendy. I think Sorry, that was a fantastic presentation. You know, we started with a kind of theory in the first session on hyperconnectivity, and Wendy's presentation did a lot to show some of the practical examples that we kind of see across North America. And also some very encouraging, I think, supplier relation and development things there, including with the carrier base. And obviously the increase of intermodal, very interesting side for FCA as well, and of course very important in terms of linking North America. I think Lewis Carroll was a very good note to finish on there, considering we have our colleagues in the other room in the psychiatrist conference, so the one pill makes you larger and one makes you smaller there as well. So our next speaker is Juan Calvillo from Ryder.
Thank you, Chris. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to hear the previous presentations from Brandon and Dr. Benoit, and then listening at Wendi as well, because it seems that we share the same concerns and we have similar expectations for the future. So hopefully, after we're done with the presentations, we will have some threads of discussions that can open some questions and take us through some deeper thinking about the status of the automotive industry and how this large region known as North America, it's becoming a very strong regional bloc for the automotive industry. I want to start with this slide that I picked because it can give us a big picture of a typical day at U.S. borders. On a daily basis, there are more than 1 million passengers going through the U.S. borders, over 300,000 vehicles, and more importantly to our discussion today, over 70,000 trucks and containers and rail containers as well. So this is a typical day at the U.S. borders. And I want to give you a perspective on how the evolution of the, not just the market, but the sourcing of production and therefore the supply chains. Back in the 80s, when manufacturing companies realized that there are some very economical reasons to move to a global market, companies became global, but when they went global, they also realized that there were savings in the production cost. So they are doing the sourcing also globally. But in recent years, what we are seeing is that even though those companies will remain global, probably the networks and the sourcing and the production is going to be centered into specific regional blocks, being one of them the NAFTA block. So there are differences between a global market, a global sourcing, global production. Companies moved there because of the low cost of productions, but now there are barriers that are going down. Labor cost beyond the borders. Let's think about emerging markets such as Asia or India. Labor rates are increasing, and therefore the low cost production is not longer that low. Supply chains became longer. So lead times were longer as well, and we had to increase on inventory levels to deal with that trade-off of reducing the production cost. I might have a longer lead time, longer supply chain, increasing inventory levels, but now the market has been more sophisticated. The customer became sophisticated. They are looking for rapid response. The natural disasters also alert us of these long supply chains. How can we respond faster to the market? So now we're moving to this regional scheme. We have rapid responses. We are taking advantage of know-how clusters. It's different from the supplier cluster. When we talk about know-how cluster, it's not just the suppliers in the same area or the same cluster, but we are talking about universities. We are talking about professional associations. we talk about research and development institutions or institutes. So it's more than just a simple supplier cluster. When we go regional, we have these advantages. And finally, how to manage the risk. How can we be more responsive and flexible to the market? So this is where we stand now. And the other greater disruption for our business, it's we want to get faster to the customer. Production is coming back from offshoring to nearshoring, either locally in the US or preferably into Mexico, because there are still some trade-offs of reduced production cost, lower production cost than in the US, while still remaining close to the market with rapid response times and with talent. So the nearshoring is here, it's increasingly. You already know your statistics for automotive. All of the major OEMs have either started or about to start production plants in Mexico. And with those plants, we will also expect to have the tier 1 supply base eventually probably moving from the US to Mexico as well. 46% of the manufacturing executive, that is almost 1 of every 2 executives, say that they are looking for nearshoring and thinking of Mexico as the option number 1 destination. Why Mexico? And Wendi talked about that. Mexico has 45 countries with trade agreements already signed, so the exposure it's higher than in the US. The US has trade agreements with probably 20 countries. And from my personal perspective, I don't think it's going to go through capacity, increasing production capacity, but increasing capabilities. The customer is more sophisticated, I was saying. So when Dr. Benoit was talking about the hyperconnectivity and how the customers wants to have linked through the Internet of Things, what is the with the car and all of the things at their homes, and all the trends that we're seeing in the market and the Amazon thing, probably the customer also wants to skip wholesalers for the spare parts of the aftermarket. So how are you going to respond to that? So some of the disruptive trends that we see in general, not just the automotive industry. But going into the automotive industry, this is some slide I want to share with you. Brandon gave us a very clear statistics, same as Wendi. Basically, these are the top 10 vehicle producers as countries. Mexico moved from number 8 to number 7, 3.5 million vehicles produced in 2015. Everybody expects that by 2020 we're going to be producing in Mexico 5 million cars. So that's a trend that we are seeing. And also as an exporter, Mexico is going to become probably the 3rd largest exporter in the near future. Half of our vehicle exportations from Mexico are coming into the US. And similar thing happens with auto parts or spare parts. We expect that we will move from number 5 exporter to number 4 or so. And again, half of the auto parts produced in Mexico are exported into the US. So you can think about the relevance of this regional block from Canada, US, and Mexico. We think that we estimate that there are at least 300 different tier 1s already established in Mexico. The number that Wendi gave us, about 2,500 companies engaged in the automotive industry, is much higher than the statistics that I have. Now, I will talk about what challenges we see when we are dealing with US and Mexico primarily, because I'm from Mexico, so I can answer that better than the relationship with Canada. But what are the challenges that we are seeing? And Wendi was very explicit on that. The supply chain needs reliability and predictability. It is impossible to predict the future, but it's very dangerous if we do not try to. So how can we manage the extreme market? How do you manage demand volatility? Wendi gave us some very specific examples on what they are doing at FCA to deal with this variability. There are also some erratic economic cycles. There is growth, there is contraction, there is recovery. It's not easy to predict what's going to happen next. So it's becoming more erratic. And then all the disruptions, either from natural disasters made us from global coming into regional, being closer to the customer, being closer, getting closer to the supply base as well for the production, but also for exogenous factors. And again, we can think of this as regulatory or safety compliance that increase the complexity of the supply chains. Think about one supply chain to bring parts or materials into the production that has to go through many echelons in the supply chain, from the producer to the truck, probably to the port, to the ocean, hitting a new port in a different country, going to truck or to rail, and going to the assembly plant. So when we go through different countries and different regions, the regulatory things that we need to comply with that can be very different from country to country and get really hard to manage. So how do we eliminate these disruptions? How can we eliminate delays? How can we maximize the supply chain flexibility? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that one size does not fit all, meaning that for different sectors or different parts that impact your supply chain, you may have different strategies. So you can be efficient, fast, and you have to think about a tailored solution with a deep knowledge of the region that you are entering. In this case, we're talking about the NAFTA region. When you talk about this as well, how can I plan on the demand and the supply the more real time as possible? Well, probably from my perspective, which is where I come from, which is a 3PL company, there are the technologies already there. So they can be used to give visibility and have this access to the statistical decision tools that probably by our own wouldn't be able to realize. Visibility. There are many handoffs in a supply chain as they become complexes. When I was talking about the rail, yet even in the rail, there are many participants in that supply chain. And whoever is managing that supply needs to have visibility on all the handoffs between the truck, the rail, the port, and the final user, as well as the shipper. Why is it important, the visibility? We can react on time. If we don't know where the load is, we don't know how long it's going to take, we cannot make any decisions to either expedite that shipment or even to know when it's going to reach my production plant. And some of the things that had happened, at least in Mexico, when we are a little bit we have a little lag against the US in terms of GPS technologies and visibility tools. It was a problem a couple of years ago. Now every time it's easier. Again, the technology barriers are disappearing. The cost of technology is becoming almost a commodity. So every time we have more access to that. What do we need to do? It's try to find someone that can give you an end-to-end track and visibility, either for the rail, either for the truck. And eventually, these complex supply chains that we see in the automotive industry, although this vertical it's probably 10 to 15 years ahead of some other industries. Let's think about electronics or pharmaceuticals. We still have room to improve. What can we do to cross the border more efficiently? Well, try to get somebody that understands what are the border processings, and that's something I will speak about in a couple of slides now, but I wanted to keep thinking about how complex it is to cross the border. What happens if you have a hot shipment? How do you manage your prioritization of the loads, even for assembly parts or for finished vehicles? How do you know what's the first container you need to unload from the rail, or what's the first container you need to unload at your plant? These type of decisions can also be hard if you don't have the visibility and if you have that end-to-end visibility or sourcing. As in Ryder, for instance, we have developed this service as what we call the border manager, and basically what it means is that you can contract on somebody, rely on somebody who can provide the visibility and who can help you to take these type of decisions. What about border crossing US and Mexico? The problem is not that it takes 2 hours or 12 hours. The real problem is that there's variability. You don't know if this time is going to take 2 hours or it's going to be 12. And I think Wendi touched that topic as well when she was talking about the average and the standard deviation. The real problem in the border of US and Mexico is that you don't know how long it's going to take to cross the border this time. How can you mitigate that? You can associate with partners in the supply chains that have certifications. They have the CityPath certification or the fast lane. Wendi showed that in her slide as well. Fast is not that you're going to cross fast the border, but it's for free and secure trade. And the free and secure trade is a specific lane in the border of US and Mexico that under certain regulations and a specific program that you get certified, you guarantee that all of the echelons in the supply chain before hitting the border are CityPath certified. So that will increase the, that will decrease, the time to cross the border. Just recently, last November, December in 2015, government of Mexico and the US decided to run pilot program that is going to last at least 6 months, where we are trying to decrease even further the time to cross the border. It's worth to notice that these pilots are starting to run with the electronics industry rather than the automotive industry. But eventually, we could have access to those pilots, or at least keeping an eye on those to see how they worked. The other thing to cross the border efficiently, and that's one of the things that the rail has done very well, it has to do with the documentation. What are the import and export rules? Usually when we go on the truck, on the typical movement of parts and materials over the road to cross the border of Mexico and the US, paperwork isn't ready. On the other hand, the rail, before shipping either from US or Mexico, paperwork, they make sure that it's ready so they can, they don't stop at the border, such as a truck would do. So as long as we keep an eye on that and we manage the information and we assure that it's going to be ready to cross the border, there's not going to be that much variability in the times and the delays. Container optimization, and Dr. Benoit, when the hyperconnectivity chat that he was telling to us, he touched a little bit about container optimization. I just read a book that it's called The Box from Mark Levinson. I don't know if someone in the audience have read that book. If not, I'd recommend it to you that you do. And this book, it's almost a treat of the sea container. It really revolutionized the way we do logistics. So we have this standard big box, 40 foot long, that it can be used in the ocean, in the rail, in a chassis, in a tractor. So this is what Dr. Benoit was talking about. How can we use that same concept in a lower scale for skids, pallets, making the encapsulation, I think Dr. Benoit called it. So this is something that we need to think through. This is something we can share. And if we make sure that our suppliers utilize these standard type of containers, and we already have the one that is going to go over the road, we can identify container pools. We can make the supply chain more efficient. We can reduce transportation costs and handling a number of containers. Here's an example of how a container pool could work when moving flows between US and Mexico. You can see it very visually. Before the US assembly plant ship returns direct to Mexico, and Mexico assembly plants, once they have the material, they return the containers to the Southeast. If we have this pool of containers and somebody who can manage that, such as a 3PL, then the assembly plants would ship direct to Southeast on behalf of Mexico assembly plant, and Mexico assembly plant would send the empty containers to another supplier in Mexico that then can return those containers to the assembly plant or another supplier. And finally, security. Every time I speak to people, there's a true concern about security in Mexico. From the Mexican side, there's also concern about security. And we're talking about potential drugs coming from Mexico to the US and weapons from the US and Mexico. But there's a real concern. How do you mitigate those risks? Well, you have to be, as we discussed, ensure that shippers, carriers, and everyone participating in the supply chain, they have this type of certifications. So it can give you some certainty that they are running business ethically. Invest in GPS and visibility. This is something we have used as logistics users or providers. It's how we can use that information that we get from a shipment to be used at the US borders with Mexico. Let's think about, if I know that the ETA of a shipment is going to be 2 p.m. o'clock today, and I saw in my GPS on my information that it made a stop, that it was not planned, it was not authorized, there's a high probability that that load might be hijacked. So eventually, we know that information. If the governments or the border controls knew this information as well, we could detect a load that we have to make a stop at the border for review, rather than just selecting any of them. And finally, the multi-point inspection processes for all loadings. I mean, it can be hidden a yard in the Mexico side of the border, so you can run all of these inspections, and particularly for those shipments that were deviated from the original planning. And with that said, I think I have nothing more to share with you in this presentation, but I would be eager to hear concerns and questions regarding the Mexico and US border. And I appreciate it. Thanks for the invite, Christopher.
Okay, muchas gracias, Juan. That was, again, another, I think we had both perspectives there from the OEM and from a leading third-party logistics provider. And you get a real sense of the scale and the complexity that goes into managing the flows across Mexico. Also, I think of the increasing sophistication of what's in Mexico. I think the idea of, both on the manufacturing side, the idea that it's just sort of simple assembly is long gone, and also the idea that the logistics market and logistics operations are somehow years behind is probably also inaccurate, or at least it's certainly catching up from the technology and also the extra security measures that we need. At our Mexico conference in January, we had a speaker from Kansas City Southern, New Mexico, and this is on the finished vehicle side, but he spoke about how the vehicle damage rates are actually the same in Mexico and the U.S. for them. However, in the U.S., I think they have 9 security guards, whereas in Mexico they had something like security agents, whereas in Mexico it was something like 1,200 or something. So it's quite it takes different efforts to maybe get some of the same results, but this is an important part of managing that supply chain. And I don't know what the crystal or what the future fortune cookie there is reading, but I don't know. I'm kind of hoping that you won't have to move those trains and trucks somehow over or under a wall in the coming years between the U.S. and Mexico. But you can just dismiss that as some foreigner's outside interpretation. I'd like to open the floor to questions now. We have about 20 or so minutes before we break for lunch. So again, we will have mics going across the room. You can put a question on the Twitter feed or on the live stream if you prefer. If you prefer not to be social, if you prefer to use social media, but we always prefer to talk physically here if we can. So if there's no questions to start, I think I'd like to start with one. Wendi, you talked about, I think, increasing intermodal. It's already increased over the last few years, and it's going to increase substantially. To clarify, I assume that's being driven cross-border, and then that is kind of mainly driven in and out of Mexico, and is that what's going to drive some of the growth? Yeah. Sorry, yeah, you get the press. Yeah, it's on now.
It is, okay. It's largely in and out of Mexico, but we're also doing it in and out of Canada. Okay. So for instance, we have suppliers in the, I'll say the different areas of Ontario where we're actually moving freight from there into our Belvedere plant in Illinois. So we really look for any opportunities to use it. As Juan mentioned, it really helps us from a border crossing standpoint in Mexico because so much of our freight is moving intermodal and rail. It really eliminates that variability of the time at the borders. So we get a benefit there as well.
And you mentioned that you identified similarities in what Professor Benoit mentioned this morning in terms, okay, maybe not in the hyperconnectivity yet, but in the same locations and places. However, how much of your logistics network would you say is shared at the moment? I mean, maybe this is also something for Ryder to comment on afterwards.
Yeah, not a huge percentage of our logistics network is shared at this point. We do it through our regional integrated logistics centers with a few different partners, but there is vast opportunity for increased usage of that. I mean, we aren't anywhere near the potential that we could reach there.
And from a third-party logistics provider standpoint, I mean, how much of that sort of combining are you already doing, and or where do you see opportunities for it?
Yeah. Can you hear me there?
Yeah.
I'm fine? Yes. Let me think about Mexico and what we are doing in Mexico. All of our network, it's already a multi-client type of facilities. So we're not just servicing the automotive industry, but also some other ones. Particularly in the automotive industry, we have developed this spare parts distribution network where we are sharing the same trucks for different OEMs. Obviously, these OEMs need to accept the collaboration, which is the difficult part. And when you mentioned that, there's no robust process of managing the relationship between OEMs. More often, I see that there's at least some willingness to collaborate, but not in that robust process as it should be to leverage all the potential savings and service improvements as well. But we are doing things. It's hard to get them on board initially because, and I think it was Dr. Benoit talking about the example of the Coke guy and the Pepsi guy in the same airplane. So it's the same thing that we are talking about. Eventually, we will move towards that situation. We all hope that we do. And from a third-party perspective, it's some of the things that the 3PL can assist the OEM industry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I think we did have a question on the left. I apologize. I'm a bit blinded on that side here. But the right.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, Steve Rand with the Hub Group. We're a large provider of intermodal transportation in North America, so I appreciate the intermodal plug. And from Wendi. You know, when you take a look at the railroads today, I think her comment was that some of the other sectors were soft, and I think that's a very kind comment. I don't know how many of you look at the earnings releases from the railroads, but what we're seeing in the U.S. right now is a true transformation of the rail industry. If you look at what's happening to coal, coal on the Union Pacific in their latest earnings release was down 43%. It's down similarly on CSX and the Norfolk Southern here in the East. I spent yesterday with the president of a Class 1 railroad who explained to me that they're reinventing their networks around intermodal. Intermodal is now 42% of the revenue on CSX. It represents 52% of the revenue on Norfolk Southern. And I think it's appropriate that this conference being in Atlanta with all the plants throughout the Southeast and many of the OEMs having corresponding plants in Mexico, I really think the next intermodal superhighway is Atlanta, places like Atlanta, Charlotte to Mexico. Both CSX and the Norfolk Southern have great connections out of here. NS to KCS over what is called the Meridian Speedway is a very high-speed route. CSX connects to the UP. They're spending millions of dollars in terminals, and this transformation of the railroad to intermodal has driven service levels to an all-time high. So yesterday I learned that this particular railroad, who I won't mention, now has surplus locomotives that are being sort of repurposed out of coal out on the right-of-way in case there's a locomotive breakdown, so that they can quickly put those locomotives against intermodal trains, automotive trains, and fleet those trains to the destination. So I guess the message is that we're a big believer in the intermodal superhighway that we think is going to develop here in the Southeast. I'm seeing all-time service level highs on intermodal at Class 1 railroads, and I'm encouraged, encouraged that Chrysler is using them. Thank you.
More of a comment, but
yeah, I mean, I'd still like to have the margins that the railroads have. So, yeah, so interesting industry there. But yeah, I mean, we're taking advantage of it, right? If other sectors are down, I'm crazy to not take advantage of that. The question will be, as assuming that those sectors rebound, can I maintain those service levels? Which is why the metrics are so important, that we're continually watching them, because I can't let that degrade and create a risk to my assembly plants. But again, the more we use it, the more we work in partnership, I'm really not seeing a lot of issues there. Now, do you sometimes have more challenging contractual relationships with some of those partners versus a trucking company? Yeah. It's a matter of leverage and how many different guys you can deal with. But it's something that we've been able to successfully overcome and create a business model that we think is really a win-win for both of us.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that, Wendy. I think that every transportation mode has its own purpose. Some parts, some materials, we have to go through railway because that makes sense. Some of them will have to be kept on truck, or probably some other transportation mode. So just take into account that every transportation mode serves a purpose, and we need to be aware of that and be ahead of, or with the right planning and of demand and supply, we can come up with what really makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, a great example of that is I mentioned that we have our own private trucking fleet, and we are in the process of moving almost all of it to compressed natural gas, because I do only local moves. We have the largest private fleet in the state of Michigan right now. Now, am I telling every carrier to go out and get compressed natural gas trucks? Absolutely not. But for us, from a sustainability and a pricing standpoint, that's the right tool for the job. There's a lot of tools out there, and it's a matter of finding the right one for the right application.
I'll go to that question in 1 second. I just want to follow up one quick point, maybe for Juan, because Steve just mentioned about maybe the growth or potential growth in intermodal out of the southeast of Mexico. And I mean, for Fiat Chrysler, one can maybe visualize why intermodal works really well, Midwest down to Mexico, boom. You know, I mean, that's a strong corridor. Are you seeing much growth from the southeast as well, or potential? I mean, if you look at the manufacturers here, maybe the density isn't quite there, but what are some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's potential. And I think Wendi was very firm on this. We talk about predictability. How confident can I be that if the rail says or intermodal says it's going to take 6 days, it's going to be 6 days. It's not going to be 4, it's not going to be 8, it's going to be 6. So as long as there's that certainty and predictability, we will start seeing some movements from truck to the rail, understanding that they are not competing against. It's complementary, and the both transportation modes are needed.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We'll take that question in the back.
Thank you. Wendi, this question is for you. I have a couple, actually. So given the backdrop of most of your tier ones and the capacity issues that we're having because of the U.S. production being where it's at, coupled with the difficulty and the congestion on the border, are you seeing that some of your tier ones are actually, and also let me add one more macro factor, the fact that money's cheap right now. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing your tier ones starting to invest in Mexico with additional bricks and mortar in capacity? And are there any trends? Is it the tier ones of the engines, for example, or the larger parts? Or what are you seeing, and what should we be watching?
Mostly that the tier ones are following the OEMs. So we're seeing more brick and mortar in Mexico, but I think that the impetus of that is more that they're following their customer base, and they need additional capacity for this market, so that's where they're making the investment. And so in some cases they're moving our production there as well, but they're constantly rebalancing. Not all of it's moving south, some of it's moving back north. Again, just trying to balance the supply and demand of what they're seeing out of their customers. And they go through learning curves too. I mean, many of them had a financial sheet that said, boy, look at how cheap it's going to be to go to such and such low-cost country, right? And it could be Mexico, it could be somewhere else. And then they found there were a lot of things that they didn't include in that equation in terms of risk factors and just other things. They were, turnover issues and things like that. And so some of them have brought some of that production back up north where they might have or back from overseas where they might have more technical expertise. So we're not seeing a lot of investment other than that of just following where the industry is going. They tend to be quite cautious on it. Even though money is cheap, they're trying to find ways other than actually investing in the brick and mortar. And so in some cases it leads more to, I would say, make buy decisions before they take that step to do more brick and mortar.
Okay, great. That's what we're seeing too. We're not sure exactly. It's a different scenario per tier one. Mm-hmm. The second question I have was, and I've had this question for a while, and I've been kind of like afraid to ask the question, to be honest with you. I don't want to jinx anything, and it's kind of maybe I should know this answer. So with all the capacity that's being created in Mexico, and there are a fair number of plants coming on between now and 2019, let's say, and the fact that we're predicting that the market in the U.S. is going to flatten out in 2018, where is all of that capacity and production going to go? Obviously, there must be plans to export it someplace. Where is it?
Yeah, each OEM would have to answer that question themselves and how they're making those decisions. But it certainly relates to the 45 trade agreements that I mentioned, where the idea when you're in Mexico is that you can export to a lot of different places. But I think each OEM would have to answer that question on their own, because certainly on the surface, it's where is all that global demand? Because at the same time that you see the expansion in Mexico, there's considerable expansion in China, India. We can go on and on. I mean, we're focused on NAFTA here, but there's expansion going on everywhere. And how that all balances with the global demand, I'm not quite sure I can reconcile those points. I'll have to defer to some of the consultants for that.
But just a little bit of perspective. So Audi, for example, which is building the Q5, will export more, or their plan is anyway, to export more to Europe than to North America for that particular product. We'll see what the forecast actually comes out to. You look at most of the capacity going in, it's obviously for small cars. And actually, I think Mexican production and exports are down this year because the US small car market is so low. And at the same time, Brazil is dwindling into near insignificance, and there's other issues. But if you see over the next couple of years, maybe the way demand shifts or change, South America comes back, depending on where demand goes. If fuel prices go up and there's suddenly more demand for sedans here, then that Mexican capacity will frankly probably supplant some of the production in the U.S. really. I mean, not for the product, but in terms of where you're fulfilling your demand. But I think it's a good question in terms of understanding the risk and as the market is changing. Any other questions or comments from the floor at this time? Oh, yep, thank you.
Hi, Wendy. I have a question for you. Sorry. Cindy Bridgman from Syncreon. What advice do you have for providers such as ourselves who would like to help facilitate this joint collaboration with other OEs and even with Tier 1s? How do we break in and bring those proposals to you guys that would be acceptable? Because I know we're doing some of it, and there is some hesitation, to want to make any suggestions or recommendations.
We've done it with several third parties by them just coming to us and saying, hey, we think there's an opportunity here, and is there someone else willing to come to the table and have that discussion? Sometimes the concern is making sure that you have the proper, I'll say, coverage. So we might use a venue like AIG just to make sure that there's no antitrust type of issues going on. But it's a matter of having willing parties. And I'd love to say that's companies, but it's not. At those companies, there are people, and people who build strategy. And it's finding those people that want to have the discussion, because what we find sometimes as we've gotten to these collaboration opportunities is it worked, maybe a door was closed, but through a management change, a door opens. And so, I'm coming from the standpoint of being very open to these opportunities. I really don't think that my company's future hinges on how efficient our logistics network is. So I'm not really afraid that there are some trade secrets that I'm gonna give to someone else. Our competitive landscape is much, much more complicated than that. Do I want to get much more efficient in my logistics? Of course I do. I want our industry to get more competitive there. In particular, I want our North American industry to get more competitive there. And so it's a matter of finding those willing participants, and they aren't even necessarily competitors. I mean, we're working with other companies in the agriculture industry that happen to be going to places near where I need to pick up too. And so I think it's companies like yours that say, hey, I know somebody that wants to talk, and that we come to the table together and figure out how much information can we share, where can we share facilities. It's really just geography. Where are we in the same places? And so we've been fairly successful with that with several of our third parties. They were usually the ones that brought it to our attention, or Ryder's our 3PL. Ryder's brought those opportunities to us. So I know in us you have a willing partner, and it's just finding who some of the other ones are. And where I'm particularly interested is beyond just the OEMs, is my Tier 1s. Because there I have a different business relationship, frankly a little more trust, right? I think that if I'm partnering with a Tier 1 that does business with me, they're going to be interested very much in a long-term relationship. And in some cases, we might have to have some long-term contracts that will survive as management changes happen. That might be the insulation that we need to continue it. But I really am clearly a believer in that's the next frontier.
Thank you.
A question just
Hi, Eric Johnson with Gain Clean Fuel. This question's for Wendi, sorry, Juan. But you just brought up the fact that you're running on compressed natural gas for your local regional operations. Obviously, we're in the station development side of things for CNG, and you're a big leader in that. So I guess from FCA's standpoint, what was the initial driver? Was it the sustainability of the prices, the sustainability on the emissions, in your opinion?
You know, I wasn't in this position when we first decided to make that move. But what we quickly found was both the sustainability and the actual financial benefit. I mean, it's not that often that you come across an opportunity that is so great for the environment, but also so financially beneficial. I mean, to us, it was just an absolute win-win. And once we could, we got past some of the psychological hurdles of our drivers, it has just been incredibly successful. I mean, we've moved our fleet at our largest terminal to that. We're in the process of getting there at our Windsor terminal as well. And we've just had nothing but success in it. When I continue to look at the financials, and there's always the question of, yeah, but look at where diesel is. Yeah, but compressed natural gas is even better. And operationally, we haven't had issues. I mean, I keep waiting, because normally when you launch something, there's launch issues. I've been in this industry a long time. Good things don't usually come easy, and for some reason, the stars have aligned as we've made that transition, and it's just gone exceptionally well. And we have it's the perfect tool for the way we operate, where it's a very local operation where we're able to do it, local, regional. But we've just had incredible success, and because I'm responsible from a P&L standpoint, I like the financial results that it's bringing me.
And of course, FCA a big leader in that, and at least for the in-house fleet. I also know, I mean, it is a trend we're starting to see. I was in Marysville, Ohio last year with Honda, and they've installed a filling station there, I think, for their, not for their in-house fleet, but for their carriers to use certain ones that do local regional routes. So certainly something we're seeing in other parts of the industry as well. Any last questions maybe from? I have one more, and it's for both. Wendi, you brought up obviously that there are lengthening supply chains because there's make-buy decisions suppliers make. They're not all running down to Toluca, I'm sure, just because you're bringing a new product there. But to what extent are you including logistics capacity, length, delivery times, changes in the kind of production planning, program planning phase, so maybe with other colleagues across FCA, so that when you look at where you might be able to identify constraints coming down the pipe?
I would say that we've used it for some of our justification for contiguous stamping operations, or expansion of our stamping operations has been a big one. One of the things that we're faced with is in rail, we use 86-foot boxcars. We like them, we know they're old, but they do the job, and they do it efficiently for us. And so with the migration of the boxcar size to the 60-foot, it's not something that we really want to do from a financial standpoint. And so that has actually been part of, not the whole thing, but certainly a part of our business decisions as we look at where we make our investment, and should we invest more locally versus transporting goods from our what we call our central stamping plants in the Detroit area. So that logistics capacity was a big part of that. That's probably the main area that has come into play. We don't necessarily have a broad awareness in our company unless we share that with them, where there might be other constraints. We're lucky enough at FCA, we're a pretty small company, and so it's very easy for us to have open venues with the head of engineering, the head of purchasing, things like that, to educate them where we might have constraints. And in that education, once they have the awareness, that really does become a criteria in their decision making.
And Juan, to what extent do you think, or is Ryder involved in, let's say, helping to assess these sort of future decisions, or even to look across at potential capacity constraints that might come? or even in planning, new locations or
right. I think my answer could be we are not as involved as we would like to be, because we can truly assist on in the decisions, or at least to have the alternative plans in case something happens. But we can see in Mexico, it's with all these new plants, OEMs coming into Mexico for 2019, probably the most. I could be concerned about infrastructure. Do we will have the enough resources to provide services to all of these OEMs all at the same time with the same ramp-up periods and launching periods? So that's something we need to keep an eye very closely. So be aware of it, ask the questions, make sure that you have the reviews constantly with your providers, with your 3PL, whoever participates, to keep an eye on that.
Okay, good. Well, I think that's a good note to end this. We've run over a little bit, but I enjoyed the discussion. I hope you found it as well. I'd like to thank both of our panelists for their time. We're serving lunch just next door, so please join us for lunch, and then we'll meet back in here at 2.